If I recall correctly, my very first exposure to Peter Sotos was the opening segment of Tool. Unlike a lot of pivotal experiences, I have no memory of the surrounding details. I was probably in my late teens. I can't remember for the life of me how I even stumbled across it, though it was definitely online. I feel confident in saying it wasn't via White House. While I was probably listening to them at the time, I didn't know or really care about the personnel behind the project. And I'm also confident in saying that it's not something I sought out in particular. I think I encountered it completely by accident. I found it in the last period where you could find something like that, by genuine accident. The waning days of Web 1.0, the last trickle of the Wild West version of the internet before it was subsumed almost entirely into the hyper-centralized, app-driven playground that it is today. It's hard to find almost anything anymore without being primed, prepped, and fluffed for it by a legion of intermediaries, influencers, and pundits, all seeking to establish a lens through which to view something long before you ever get to lay eyes on it yourself. And granted, in my own way, I'm one of them. As I write this, one of the books I'm currently reading is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, since I never got around to it in high school. My edition is a very contemporary one, though, and it's littered with forewords and explanatory footnotes which, while helpful in deciphering late 19th century nautical terminology, also damage the flow of reading. My eye is always darting to the bottom of the page and picking back up where I left off mid-sentence. Moreover, it reduces my distance from the source material, which may sound like a good thing, but actually eliminates some of the appeal for me. When I read an old book, I tend to appreciate the alien territory I find myself in. Unfamiliar words, regional dialects, turns of phrase, historical anecdotes. I enjoy my own lack of recognition. That a place and a time can be appreciably different in an era where things seem ever more flattened and universal. While I may understand Heart of Darkness better with the footnotes, I think I experience it less. I say this to illustrate why I think the manner in which I first encountered Tool is ideal. Stumbling across it contextless and unmoored on the internet is second only in my mind to finding its blearily photocopied pages on a park bench somewhere. Devoid of any literary pretension or location within an author's bibliography, it possesses a certain totemic power that I've seen very rarely in other writing. This is one of the reasons I so strongly believe in reading Sotos books rather than scans. The very idea that their content, like a catalog of horrendous, intrusive thoughts, was given a permanent record that can simply be opened and looked at is shocking on its own. The objects themselves have an aura around them if you know what they are. I can't recall any of the context around my reading the first passage of Tool so long ago, but I can remember my reaction to it. I wasn't offended or particularly shocked, this much I know, but I can remember a sensation or an understanding, distinct from a feeling, that by reading it I had crossed a certain Rubicon. In some corner of my mind I figured that something like it must exist in the same way that dark matter or snuff films must. That there must be something out there composed of pitch-black negative space that doesn't rebel against humanist values so much as negate them entirely. I am, at my root, a person fixated on extremity, finality, the omega point of a given creative process. But I am not a person with a particularly novel creative mind. I work with already existing materials almost exclusively. I might be able to arrange them in a way that draws out interesting potentials, but I am rarely, if ever, capable of creating something truly new. Understanding that, it seemed inevitable that somewhere out there in the great vastness of literature, something like Tool must exist, given that its broad strokes existed in my mind already. Something truly, deliberately, and unerringly despicable. The details I wasn't sure of, but its shape I was. And so, upon finally encountering Tool in the wild, I remember my primary thought being, ah, yes, so this is it. And in that moment, it suddenly existed, not merely as a potential, but a concrete reality. It had been done. This might not seem like such a big distinction to you, but it is to me. It indicated that there were people out there interested, at least in some sense, in the same things I was. It's not that I felt like I suddenly belonged somewhere, that I could be part of some sort of social group that would welcome me in, nothing like that. It was more that a blank space on a map had been filled in, revealing not merely further expanses of ocean, but a great dark continent to explore. Tool, to me, represented not so much a kind of person, but a kind of place. And, importantly, it is in large part the place where I live. It seems to me that the purpose of transgressive literature is not merely to shock and appall, though those are welcome features, but to, well, transgress. While that word may be specifically moral in nature, its prefix is about travel, crossing, moving beyond or outside, and with those things, expansion. There's all sorts of transgressive literature out there that transgresses certain commonly held moral boundaries, but does nothing structurally or philosophically novel. See the glut of so-called extreme horror novels that infest TikTok videos shot by girls with gender trouble and septum rings. These kinds of things might be fun to read on occasion, but they are, at their heart, just a heightened kind of genre fiction. Nothing too far from Stephen King, but with more gore and less simple blue-collar talent. In fact, positioning all this extreme content within the boundaries of otherwise standard genre fiction, to me, drains that content of much of its elemental power. By situating these sorts of acts within the established, comfortable structures of typical storytelling, we're able to easily contextualize them as something we're familiar with, but more. In that case, no new territory is explored, and the reader is largely left in the same place they started, unmoved. I believe this is why Tool stuck with me so intensely, and why it sparked such a lifelong fascination with Peter Sotos' work. Were the subject matter the only point of interest, his writing might have been a footnote to my artistic tastes, a freak show I could scare my friends with. Instead, the callousness and cruelty of the work operated within a structure and style that was equally alienating. The opening segment of Tool resembled nothing I'd encountered before. The harsh repetition, the flickering stream of consciousness, the accusatory second-person perspective. It was deeply striking in its presentation, to say nothing about the content itself. All these elements might seem like pretty standard fare to the seasoned reader, and it is, to a point, but you can imagine that encountering this right out of high school might allow it to punch above its weight, especially in an era just before access to such things was basically universal. The emotional wavelength of it, too, was something that gave me pause. These sorts of depictions of callous, sadistic violence tended toward the Silence of the Lambs model back in those days. Elegant, elitist vampires toying with their victims, perpetually channeling the French libertines as though that was the absolute apex of abjection. Tool was different. White-hot rage pours off it, deliberately unsophisticated, angry and violent and puerile and vulgar. In short, something that felt more immediate and real, hypermodern in a sense in its rejection of the standard atmosphere of material this dark. Tool was as far from a poshly appointed playroom of the aristocracy as can be imagined. It was writing for alleys, public bathrooms, ugly studio apartments, crack houses, gas stations with workers behind bulletproof glass. While I have a certain appreciation for the more romantic and opulent takes on this kind of thing, Sotos' version, young, stupid, angry, poor, ugly, small, and mean-minded, is the one I identify with much more powerfully. Dumb, pig-headed, squat, ugly concrete buildings, half a cigarette relit for the drive home, poor diction when reading out loud, garage swastika tattoos, portable classrooms, portable toilets, scared and stupid people who are absolutely no more admirable for their fearfulness or stupidity. These were things expressed to me by Tool, freely associated from its own minimal harshness. Things I knew and felt from my own life in an ugly little Florida oxy town. Experimental writing struck me, and still strikes me in large part, as the domain of artists, where the word means a social class rather than a description of activity. I've never felt comfortable among them, and Sotos' writing did not seem to be for them. Tool isn't perfect. Far from it. Its 8 pieces are highly uneven, both between each other and within themselves. It is highly experimental, an author trying to chisel out a voice from a big block of granite, and it misses as often as it hits. There are attempts made at writing styles which Sotos never revisits, and for good reason. It is, like Pure, prone to substantial moments of juvenile antagonism which do not perform any better than the first time around. That being said, this is Sotos' first work which displays, albeit in embryonic form, what he would later become. It is, to me, the true beginning of Sotos as an author. Very rough, unrefined, still frequently silly, but an absolutely crucial part of his bibliography, if for no reason other than how it lights the flame of so many of the techniques and subjects that will become crucial to his work from here on out. And even now, many years later, that opening piece still gives me pause. No more hugs from Mommy. No more love from anyone. No one loves you anymore. No one cares if you live or die. Your mom cares, I guess, so I'm sorry. I made a mistake. No one but your mom cares. But you'll never see your mom again, so I guess no one fucking cares for this poor fucking little fucking cunt who sits in front of me crying like a big fucking baby. Cry, cry, cry baby, fucking cunt, cry baby, cunt, bitch, fucking pig, fucking pussy. You really are disgusting. You really are. I want to hurt you so fucking bad. Tool was written in 1991, but unreleased until its compilation in Total Abuse in 1995. At least this is the standard description of its history. The reality is a little bit more complicated. In 1994, the opening piece of Tool that I mentioned encountering in the wild previously was featured in Answer Me No. 4 under the title Quality Time, the same title which would be used for the White House record released the following year. But before that, it appears that Sotos was distributing hand-bound copies of Tool to friends prior to its release in Total Abuse. The year I've seen for this is 1993, but I don't doubt that it went further back than this. I'm also not sure just how long it took to write all the material in Tool. While 1991 is frequently cited as the year the book was written, I feel like I've seen mentions, perhaps in an interview with Sotos, that some of the material dates back to the late 80s, which makes more intuitive sense to me than the idea that Sotos simply didn't write for over half a decade. I think that when he started, he never really stopped. Maybe not all of it came to print. I can imagine Tool getting composed like a rock album with numerous tracks written and recorded, but only what he felt were the best or most representative making the cut. Given Sotos' fixations on certain activities and atmospheres, resulting in many moments across his bibliography essentially being progressively more refined or differently angled versions of the same ideas, it's very possible, at least to me, that each of the pieces here has, somewhere in his archives, lesser versions left on the cutting room floor. And just for the sake of completion, it should also be noted that Tool was given one standalone release on 9-banded books in 2013. It's probably slightly easier to find, or at least cheaper than Total Abuse, but not by much. And it was also included in Proxy, but unless you have $1,000 to drop on a used book or stumble across a high-quality bootleg like I have, good luck with that. Tool is most easily described as a collection of essays and short fiction, but like everything else in Sotos' career, it defies any attempt at neat description. Composed of 8 individual pieces, the first relatively long, the others shorter and punchier, it serves as, in retrospect, a kind of sampler platter of most of the topics that the author would fixate on for the rest of his career. Total Abuse taken as a whole can be considered in this manner. If Pure is Sotos, most fixated on true crime, and Parasite is his take on media critique, Tool is the most personal and traditionally literary of the three. It's also, to my knowledge, the only time in Sotos' career that he delves explicitly into fiction. Much of Sotos' work has fictional elements, navigating just how much of his writing is real and how much is hyperbole or outright fiction is a thread of discussion that will grow more significant later in his career. But Tool features pieces that clearly function in the manner of short stories, albeit weird ones with unconventional structures. This is an experiment that isn't repeated, probably because, frankly, they're not very good. Sotos is a writer who, for all his talents, appears to have immense difficulty writing in voices other than his own. The intensely personal focus of his material is a double-edged sword in this regard. The short story-style pieces in Tool are some of his weakest work by a wide margin, and certain moments are somewhat infamous to fans of his work for their clumsiness. That being said, it's difficult to make a hard and fast distinction between the good and bad pieces in Tool. While certain ones have a reputation for being clunkers, on a reread this isn't entirely accurate. There are passages that are clunkers, certainly, but this rarely extends to an entire piece. The opposite is also true. Some of the best pieces in Tool will have their flow interrupted by goofy lines that needed another pass in editing. This is in large part due to Sotos beginning to find his style. Not quite free associative, but containing a certain dream logic in the interrelation of disparate ideas, or at least beholden to a logic entirely internal to Sotos, only the outline of which can be easily perceived. Sotos will freely move between perspectives, memories, fictionalized or real accounts of crimes, and numerous other topics with little interest in assisting the reader in navigating a certain thread that would develop a central idea. While this tendency was present in Pure, its function as largely true crime documentation provided certain guardrails that kept everything on topic. Here, there's no such restriction. While it's hardly as wild and woolly as some of the later material we'd end up seeing from the author, we're certainly at the trailhead of a very unique sense of structure and style. Which brings us to the structure of Tool itself. As stated previously, Tool is composed of 8 individual pieces and can be read as such. However, I think there's a sort of structure that emerges in the layout of these pieces. To continue the analogy of writing as recording, I would say that the track order on this is very important. My take is something like this. Tool is composed of 2 halves, sides A and B, if you will, which feature the same internal structure within each half. Sotos is fond of these structural loops, linear processes that repeat in total while composed of smaller elements within them. An important distinction, I think, is that he doesn't typically set up mirroring structures, where the reader starts in one place, ventures out into unknown territory, and returns back to the origin. Completion, I think, is important to Sotos. The point is not to express a futile, eternally recurrent cycle of behavior. I think that would strike him as perversely humanist in a way. Instead, he wants to present linear sequences of events which do achieve conclusions, but are nonetheless ultimately vacuous and unable to achieve any sort of permanent satisfaction. Sotos tends to write about desire, impulse, and obsession, and within those things, the infinite, yawning hunger that cannot be satisfied merely by taking part in them. Make no mistake, there's no escaping these hungers in the same way there's no escaping physical hunger for food. Because just like that physical hunger, these more abstract desires are not spiritual in nature. They are just as real and immediate as the need for food, and what some describe as rising above one's baser nature is usually a matter of discovering proxies or substitutes for the real object of obsession. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. All of that will become relevant much later. Back to the structure of Tool. I don't typically like to go blow by blow when I talk about art. I'm not into track-by-track descriptions of albums or beat-by-beat analysis of stories in games or movies, mostly because I don't feel that's the best way to talk about art in general, since the whole experience of something is an aggregate effect, not a summation of parts. That being said, Tool, I think, is best discussed in a manner a little bit more granular than I typically would. 1, because the pieces are unusually individual for Sotos' work, and 2, because so many important concepts are laid out here for future work, and in a relatively precise and particular manner, without so much of the complex interrelation and difficult-to-parse text of later material. But I think to best explicate these ideas, we'll have to tackle the pieces in an unusual order, and in some seemingly odd combinations. Hopefully, as my discussion of them progresses, the purpose of this configuration will make more sense. And now, with all the necessary preamble out of the way, Tool. The pieces in Tool are untitled, only identified numerically. For the sake of convenience, I'll be referring to them by their number. Not owning a standalone copy of Tool, I don't know if they're given proper titles in that version. This leaves the opening section of the book, the only one with a title to my knowledge, albeit one not represented here in Total Abuse, Quality Time. With that in mind, it's the first piece we'll be examining, the longest, and in some sense, the most defining and important in the collection. In fact, it could be argued that Quality Time is, in fact, the most defining piece of Sotos' career. Not his best, but his most defining in that it manages to encapsulate the largest part of his writing in the fewest pages. It is the piece which really fires the starting pistol for his style. It establishes multiple techniques which would become indispensable to his writing, sets the foundation for his personal stylistic voice, and, in a more ephemeral sense, is the first piece of his writing that really feels like Sotos in the sense his fans are largely familiar with. I would go as far as to say that much of the rest of Tool feels like bonus material after this initial volley. While there's stuff I enjoy in it, a large part of the most important content to understanding Sotos can be found in this piece alone. For those of you with a more finite interest in the author's work, I would suggest that, if nothing else, you read this segment alone. Actually, I think I'd suggest that just about anyone read this segment alone, even if they have absolutely zero interest in Sotos' work beyond it. In terms of bang for your buck and page count, there's little in his bibliography that compares to this in terms of efficiency of prose. Reading Quality Time won't provide the whole story of Sotos, not by a long shot, but it will give the reader enough of one to start really understanding this corner of the literary world. Quality Time consists of one side of a conversation, monologue, sadistic gloating session, what have you, between a child abductor and his victim, largely patterned after, as many have noted previously, the publicly available segment of transcript from the Brady Hindley tape taken from before the murder of Leslie Ann Downey. Information about Ian Brady and Myra Hindley is widely available in countless articles and books, and given that their crimes are not a particular fascination of mine, there are better places to consult for information on them. That being said, the nutshell version for those entirely unfamiliar. Brady and Hindley were a serial child-murdering couple active in England in the early to mid-60s, occupying a place of infamy in that country similar to Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka in Canada. This infamy exists in large part due to the couple recording the run-up to the murder of one of their victims, Leslie Ann Downey, on reel-to-reel tape. One of, if not the earliest accounts of, as far as my knowledge goes, killers recording their actions in this manner. A couple pages of transcripts from this tape are publicly available to this day, and these are the pages that Quality Time is based on, at least to some degree. The murder of Leslie Ann Downey is the single most primary criminal fixation of Peter Sotos, an act which will come to define his worldview, understanding of violence, and understanding of himself in multiple arcs over the years. This will become far more important later in his career, but despite Brady and Hindley's lengthy mentions in Pure, this is where this particular crime becomes a central part of Sotos' writing for the next several decades. That being said, Quality Time is not merely a remix of that transcript. I think perhaps too much has been made of that connection. That transcript is merely a foundation, a launch pad for Sotos to expand from in directions that are particular to himself. Much of Sotos' work operates in this manner, starting from a single origin point, frequently a specific piece of media, and then expanding outward from there, with the connection between the starting point and its elaborations governed by an internal process unique to Sotos. Placing the Brady Hindley transcript next to Quality Time, the differences are clear. While the framing of each might be similar, Sotos' version is far more vulgar, literary, and expansive in its delivery. The established structure, the literal events of the story, are little more than a device to provide Sotos the opportunity to express commentary on the Brady Hindley tape and the emotional and psychological traumas suggested by it. It is not, in the end, about the tape at all. It is about what Sotos reads in that transcript, what he imagines surrounds it, and, in some ways, the totemic power it holds over his own psychology. Sotos projects openly, strongly, nakedly, and unapologetically onto the media he writes about. This is a feature, not a bug. As he frequently says in some form or another, Sotos' writing is always intensely personal, and so his personal relationship to the material he discusses or patterns his own writing after will always be a crucial element. Quality Time begins as follows. "You're such a pretty girl. You shouldn't cry. Such a dear. Those tears aren't pretty, are they? Look at me, stupid. Now are those fucking tears pretty? Cunt. Do you like making your mommy cry? Do you like that, huh? The poor fucking woman. You selfish little brat, you cunt. How do you think she feels, huh? Huh, cunt? How terrible you are, how mean and cruel to your mother you are. Don't you feel horrible, making her cry? Making her hurt so badly? I think you're absolutely terrible. A fucking brat. Fucking horrible cunt. Shame on you. Now there, crying won't help. You already made your mommy cry. Nothing can help your mom now. She feels very, very bad and you did it. You can't change that, cunt. You're a cunt and mama's gonna cry for fucking ever. Your mama's gonna miss you something awful. She'll never get over you leaving her and never coming back. You're killing her. It's all your fault. The center of Quality Time can be found in its opening paragraphs. Psychological sadism via the extended suffering of not merely a victim, but that victim's loved ones. This fixation on the second-order impacts of sexual violence is something first explored in Pure, but more fully fleshed out here. In Pure, Sotos ruminates extensively on the suffering of the families of victims, among them, you guessed it, the family of Leslie Ann Downey. But where in Pure, Sotos could only guess, or hope, maybe, that this extended suffering was a specific goal and pleasure of Brady's, here we see Sotos exploring the idea from the perspective of just such a sadist. Quality Time moves around a fair amount, with the narrator poking and prodding at his victim with taunts, promises of unimaginable suffering, strange excursions into discussions of pornography, feminism, television, what have you, but it always comes back to this central point, the future suffering of the victim's mother. All other elements of the piece feed into this, leading inexorably back to this particular fixation. This obsession is one that will come up time and time again in Sotos' work, so much so that it will be the first device of his that I feel the need to come up with a name for to reference more easily in the future. Let's call this the Stabat Mater, both for the reference to Mary's suffering at Christ's crucifixion and also as a cute little inside joke. For our purposes, the Stabat Mater will refer to the suffering of the mothers of victimized children, or, more broadly, the dark intersection between motherhood and Sotos' personal criminal obsessions in general. This concept is one which I personally see as a primary pillar of Sotos' writing. I believe there's a strong implication in much of his work that Sotos perceives the pleasure in the Stabat Mater as the ultimate sadism, and conversely, the Stabat Mater itself as the ultimate human suffering. This concept will be revisited several more times in Tool alone, and countless more in following works. While Sotos, to my knowledge, has never commented on this particular obsession directly, I think the sheer amount it's featured in his work suggests that it is, in fact, a major and significant part of the overall picture of his creative output. I'll continue to bring this up as it appears both in Tool and elsewhere, but for the time being, file this away as a meaningful avenue of inquiry in the near future. It'll expand into a cluster of concepts with numerous implications, but for Tool, only this immediate initial form is relevant. In the case of Quality Time, though, the Stabat Mater isn't merely a source of sadistic pleasure, but a particular and primary threat delivered to the child victim. Repeatedly, this concept is emphasized as a cruelty just as bad, if not worse than the physical suffering itself. Think now of how painful the rest of your mommy's life is going to be, how she'll hurt from the moment she notices you're gone till the day she dies, how she'll never be able to think of anything else, how nothing else will ever matter, how no other thoughts will be able to push the images of your pain and torture and desperate death out of her mind. You will always be there like a Catholic's bleeding and crying Christ on a cross in the forefront of her mind. Everything she does from now on will be controlled by images of you laughing in your crib, turning into images of you silent in your casket. While Sotos frequently operates in the realm of physical cruelty, disgust, open vulgarity, etc., this is the true center of his transgression and the primary source of his own sadistic pleasure, the psychological suffering of a victim above and beyond the mere physical. Throughout Sotos' work, this psychological consideration of the victim's agony is paramount. It's in this consideration that Sotos draws a distinction between people like himself and those who are there for something simpler and more immediate. I would say, ironically, that the latter were those who Pure appealed to more broadly. Sotos addresses this in a way in Total Abuse's opening interview. Goad. Another thing that's unique about your writing, you stand alone in the degree to which you focus on and gloat over the pain of victims' families. I've never really seen anyone else approach it quite that way. Sotos. What really happened was that when I found that when I was reading these books or when I was watching these things on TV, these news reports, is that the newscasters would constantly go to the family for their reaction. How do you feel that your daughter's been kidnapped? And, the family would break down. And I don't think I'm the only person who said that was a very exciting moment. And for however you want to define exciting, and I did the same, I just responded to that, and not with the same sort of moralistic gloss to it. An interesting tension is revealed by this question and answer. A typical bit of apologetics performed by fans of Sotos is that the author is drawing attention to and condemning the news media's pornographic fixation on the suffering of victims and their families. While there may be some kernel of truth to this, located deep, deep down in Sotos' subconscious, I have seen no evidence that he feels this way himself. Later work will complicate this assessment substantially, but I think it's fairly clear that, at least in Tool, Sotos' interest in this sort of thing is purely sadistic in nature. Sure, some sort of hypocrisy can be recognized, this becomes a major part of his material in Parasite, but the mere recognition of this state of affairs doesn't in and of itself turn works like Tool into some sort of humanist effort. It is, as I said regarding Pure, pornography first and foremost. While Quality Time revolves around a particular kind of psychological torment as its North Star, this is not to say that it dwells purely in those realms. There's plenty of blunt, awful stuff in there, too. Take this passage, which I distinctly remember as one of the most discomforting things in the piece when I first read it so many years ago. Do you know what these are? Have you ever seen your daddy shave his face? In the morning, have you ever watched him in front of the mirror with cream all over his face? When he looks just like Santa Claus? These are toys. Fun toys. Here. Sharp, isn't it? Be careful, dear. Hold it in your palm. Give it back now. There's a good girl. There's a good girl. Not a terribly bright girl, but a good girl. Mommy told you to be careful with sharp things, didn't she? Didn't she? Answer. What? Pardon? Excuse me? Answer me now, cunt. Shut up. Cunt. Why does Mommy want you to be careful? Why? Because sharp things can cut us, right? They hurt us, if we're not careful. Never eat sharp things. Put this in your mouth. Open up. Open up. Wide. This won't hurt. I was only kidding. See? It's just a toy. It's just pretend. It's not really sharp. Now open your mouth and see. Open your fucking mouth or I'll smash it open. Now. Cunt. Stick this in. Shut up. Quit your crying. And stop your yelling. You're giving me a headache. Shut the fuck up. You're getting blood all over the fucking place. Wipe yourself. Clean yourself up. Hurts, doesn't it? Yes, I know, baby. There. Shh. Shut the fuck up before I fucking rip your head off. You stupid little baby. You want to chew on another razor blade? Then shut up. Stop crying and yelling and drooling and bleeding and... Jesus fuck, you're a fucking mess. Fucking pig. You really should have known better. Shut your trap or I'll hit you again. I'll cut your lip again. You want me to yank your teeth out? I'll slice your lips up all over again if you don't stop crying. Apart from the sheer ugliness of this passage, its unvarnished, loathsome cruelty, there's actually several technical aspects to Sotos' developing writing style that it provides a great example of. Let's run through them. First off, something that actually makes my job more difficult, the medium specificity of Sotos' writing. I have a pet theory that authors tend to stylize themselves somewhere on a gradient between the written and spoken word. For instance, in my own writing, I have a moderately strong bias toward the spoken form. I tend to hear my writing in my own voice. I'll frequently read passages out loud when I'm editing, and obviously much of my writing is designed with a spoken presentation in mind, like you're hearing now. Sotos, on the other hand, skews dramatically in the opposite direction, especially as his career progresses. His writing is that of the written word, located very deliberately on the page, and it does not lend itself easily to a spoken interpretation. The previous passage is mostly composed of individual lines, one after the other, a single side of a conversation with responses implied between them. This is basically impossible to replicate in spoken form. It's not really possible for me to read much of his content with the full effect that reading it has. On the occasion that you hear Sotos performing a reading of his own work, he stumbles here and there. Some of this is nervousness, sure, but much of it is simply because Sotos does not write in a manner that privileges the more organic, musical quality of speech over the deliberately inorganic and terse quality of movable type. This specific motif, these long stretches of single lines obstinately refusing arrangement into paragraphs, is one that recurs constantly in his writing. This single-sided dialogue is a technique that will become crucial from here on out, which naturally dovetails with Sotos' tendency toward writing in the second person. In fact, I would argue that the second person is actually Sotos' dominant point of view, perhaps not in pure word count, but certainly in gravity and intensity. The second-person perspective, with its insistent you, is inherently accusatory, hostile, judgmental, belittling. It makes you the subject of every sentence. It's the language of being watched, studied, observed. Typically, with regard to Sotos, critics suggest that the you in question is the reader. This seems like the standard interpretation of this sort of thing. I'm not so sure. Note that in resentful hardcore songs, the you in question is never the listener. In Quality Time, the you is fairly straightforward, given that the story is actually told from a first-person perspective. In the future, though, the identity of you will become far murkier and more inconsistent. We'll return to that idea down the road. Much of Quality Time is made up of passages like this, breaking up the more conventional, ruminating passages of paragraphs. It's largely very good and understandably disquieting if you're not familiar with this sort of thing. That being said, there's a delicate tightrope to walk with content like this, and there's a couple instances where Sotos topples over, especially toward the end. Go ahead, cry. Stop crying. Grow up. What's your name? What's your mama's name? What kind of dog do you have? Ever seen its dick? Did you ever play with your dog's fuzzy red dick? What about your dad? Have you ever seen your dad's dick, huh? Have you ever had your dad's meat in your mouth? Has he ever shoved it your way when you expected him to tuck you in bed? All of this is vulgar and upsetting, sure, but it also strikes me as a little silly. I think a criticism that could be broadly leveled at Sotos is that he often has trouble with the endings of pieces. Sotos is at his best in the middle of texts, where his almost free associative tendencies are most comfortable, but he can have a little trouble getting things spun up and a little more winding them down. Oniric and hypnotic writing like his rarely makes for punchy writing, and while Quality Time's catalog of ranting cruelty is mostly effective, passages like the above feel kind of like grasping at straws. It kind of reminds me of the back third of Samuel Delaney's Hog, where, apropos of nothing, everyone turns into a scat queen. At a certain point, the stakes have risen as high as they'll go, and any attempt to raise them further just comes off as goofy and juvenile. It'll take a little while for those impulses to fully leave Sotos' writing. Fortunately, though, this is not a problem that afflicts the next piece we'll be looking at, which I consider the strongest in the book, and the one that is most closely related to where Sotos' career would end up going many years later. If Quality Time opens Side A of Tool, 5 opens Side B. Probably the second most talked about portion of the book after the opening segment, 5 details Sotos' child pornography arrest shortly after the initial publication of Pure, as I detailed in that episode and as detailed by everyone on the planet who knows the man's name. It is, in my estimation, the strongest piece in the collection by a wide margin, and while Quality Time may be more emblematic of this phase of his career, this entry feels almost like it comes from some of his work over a decade later. Like Quality Time, it marks the first occasion of many crucial techniques in Sotos' later style, and it's strikingly revealing, vulnerable, and illuminating in the way that the rest of Tool really isn't. Unsurprisingly, it's my favorite due in large part to its resemblance to my favorite material by the author. Still raw, vulgar, cruel, and contemptuous, but more emotionally varied, intimate, and, dare I say, human without being humanist. 5 centers on Sotos' experiences when brought in by Chicago PD, I presume, his booking, interactions with the police officers, and other fragments of his involvement with the justice system. In what is already becoming a refrain in my descriptions of the author's work, Sotos' arrest is a primary framing device or anchor for a piece which moves in other directions. Ruminations on child pornography, naturally, some pure-like descriptions of child abuse, likely taken from actual documentation, and, most interestingly, a sort of psychological analysis of the police officers involved. Particularly fascinating in his strange empathy with them beyond his initial resentment for the situation. Like the best parts of Pure, and where his writing style would largely go over the following years, Sotos drifts in and out of all these components, with memories of the arrest process progressing alongside those various other ruminations, allowing connections, conceptual relationships, and loose metaphors to congeal gradually and naturally through mere proximity. One of the things I admire most about Sotos' writing is his ability to use these arguably modernist or even postmodernist literary techniques to actually produce ideas of intellectual value. I'm naturally suspicious of most of these freewheeling, somewhat naturally pretentious schemas, but Sotos is one of the few writers who really justifies them as legitimate techniques. The biggest new development found in 5 is the obvious one. This is the first time we've seen Sotos talk about himself and his own experiences in very direct terms. Over time, much of Sotos' work will become about himself, either directly or obliquely, and its placement in this collection makes it stand out dramatically. There are other pieces in Tool which come from a first-person perspective, with Sotos speaking rather clearly as himself, but unlike 5, they're a bit more literary, based on personal experiences, sure, but not what seems to be the relatively unvarnished picture we see here. That being said, I'd like to make a very important point about Sotos' work. There's a tremendous amount of debate to be had as to what or how much of his material is based on real experiences, personal or otherwise. It's never an easy question, and I would say there's a vast mixture of authenticity on display. Some complete facts, some complete fiction, collections of bits of reality recontextualized into a fictional construct, some reality hyperbolized to near absurdity, and probably some what-if type imaginings of alternate routes for real experiences. It's never made clear, and as such, any time I describe something as real or fictional is my interpretation alone. That being said, I think the lines of demarcation between fact and fiction are clearer in Tool than they will be in the future. I don't plan to dwell too much on these sorts of questions. I think they end up largely being a distraction from the content itself, but they'll become more important in the near future in the author's bibliography, and I'll address it when I feel it's especially relevant. 5 begins rough, resentful, and caustic, as you would probably expect. This dick. This fucking idiot who, because he knows his job too fucking well, thinks he's a bright little boy. Sitting at the opposite end of this ratty Formica top lunch table, he stretches, clasps his hands together in the air, and brings them back behind his head. He's still wearing that stupid green logger's cap, even though we've been sitting inside for the past 3 hours. Everything's attitude with this bore. Sizing me up and psyching me out. Regular guy blue jeans and flannel shirt, mousy mustache and beard, slow Chicago accent and dim eyes. He sighs and asks me what I know about Melissa Ackerman. He wants to talk about it because he's talked to some of the other cops that are working on the case downstate. Then he asks me about Robin Gecht. It was his job to talk to some of the hookers and follow up on some of the leads in Gecht's crimes, and he's really quick to tell me he even picked up some of the mutilated hooker corpses. My situation hardly calls for irreverence, so I'm compliant. This dick wants to fill me in. Wants to show off, I figure, but wants to act like he's drilling me for info. Wants to see how much I know. What a dick. Sotos always writes first and foremost about people. It might take different shapes, analysis of pornography, art criticism, but I repeat myself, true crime, but I repeat myself again, but ultimately these are all paths toward the same thing, the interior lives of people, and more specifically members of the underclass, prostitutes, junkies, criminals, etc. But the members of the underclass are not merely those who we typically understand as such. It also includes normal members of society who come into contact with these preceding elements. Johns, victims of crimes, those victims' families, and, in the case of 5, police officers. If I can be permitted a little bit of more traditional literary analysis here, I'd suggest that the upshot of 5, for all its digressions, is about the infectious mimetic quality of contact with the underclass. Sotos is interested not in the differences between himself and the police officers questioning him, but the similarities. Not in the sense of some kind of we're not so different, you and I villain monologue, but in the sense that coming into contact with these corrupting influences establishes a commonality of experience that carries a heavy weight. It is, in at least some sense, curiously understanding of those who, at least in the moment of Sotos' arrest, have complete power over him. This isn't to say that 5 is some hagiography of the boys in blue. No, Sotos still hates them. But his contempt for them and his powerful understanding of them are able to coexist without dissonance, much in the way that Sotos can despise a prostitute while fully understanding his or her interior life, and, in fact, perhaps despises them because he understands that interior life. Sotos can find the police officers alternately cajoling and bullying him repellent yet reasonable. Following that, it flows in the other direction. His understanding of these men does not mean that he sympathizes with them. In fact, this understanding is another vector of attack against them. A quick reminder from my piece on Pure. I will from time to time have to censor certain words in order to stay outside the long reach of terms of service rules on the various platforms this is hosted on. I think it will be fairly obvious what I am editing out in the following readings. The Black tells me how much he hates looking at this stuff. I think every cop, dick, and DA that I've ever talked to has made sure I knew that. I would suggest another job. Honestly, it can't be worth it. Just imagine the horrible possibility of one of these poor men fucking their wife's depths, grabbing her big titties and sucking her tongue and plowing ever harder, ever faster when, all of a sudden, that evil image of child fellatio hits him in his forehead. I'm sure it's enough to make him lose his erection. Imagine my black cop fucking his wife doggy style or rubbing his greasy dick on his wife's saggy breasts and having to struggle to dissociate his feelings of pure love with my demented notions of fun. It's enough to make him swear off begging his wife to let him in her ass forever. And good lord, how will we ever help his little baby daughter potty train or take a bath? This is a crucial element of Sotos' work that I believe is foundational but rarely commented on. The idea that understanding does not necessarily breed humanist compassion or respect. This is an underlying theme that explains much of the confusion that many people coming from outside, so to speak, have about his writing. This will necessitate a little divergence, but I'll try to keep it brief. One of the profound misunderstandings of secular modernity, liberalism, humanism, globalism, whatever your preferred flavor, is that value judgments are arguments that can, through logic and rational debate, be settled. That with a sufficient amount of education, communication, and understanding, humans can largely agree with one another on what is good, what is sensible, and what is right. This comes with it an understood but rarely discussed assumption that evil, cruelty, violence, depravity, and all other negative things are largely a result of ignorance or some psychological defect, that these negative thoughts, feelings, and actions are fundamentally irrational. As such, it's nearly impossible for amorality to be just that, amorality. It always points to a deficiency located elsewhere. The last vestiges of religiosity in a nearly fully secularized world. It probably goes without saying that this is all highly incorrect. Understanding does not necessarily breed compassion. In fact, it frequently corresponds to the opposite. There are many things that I have only grown to hate more as I've understood them further. Most people make the same mistake as every student activist and every girlfriend you've ever had who says she wants to know the real you. Sotos understands this intimately, which neatly undercuts the supposed motivations behind true crime nonsense or any daytime TV horror show. Dr. Phil's expose on anorexia coincidentally involving pictures of hot, skinny teenage girls, raising awareness one creep shot at a time. You can do evil with full consciousness of it, with intent and control and malice in your heart. I have. I bet you have too. A copper who's always thinking, brings this shit home with him, deals with reality, doesn't try to escape, but rather integrates all the facts into a lifelong drive for truth and human rights. A cop who sees today's headlines and TV themes, who checks which way the wind's blowing, watches the waves and trends of society and hopes that human nature must be better than its actions. He tortures himself nightly. Can people be just this bad, or is it reflexive trauma? Are these criminals victims, perhaps? Or is it a simple question of control, or rather the lack of it? I just jail the sick, he figures, but most importantly, I protect the innocent. You wouldn't believe what I deal with, he says. It's such a nightmare. The lines are never black and white. Take, for instance, that most abused kids want to stay with their abusive parents. Love. Love is a very weird thing, and kids are so impressionable, so easy to brainwash. Have you ever heard that one song by Madonna? If there's a flaw to 5, it's in Sotos' still-present insistence on a kind of self-mythologizing. Put more bluntly, he still wants to be a tough guy. This is, unfortunately, a tendency that will transform in nature but never entirely disappear. It's at its most juvenile in the material and total abuse, but will become sublimated into other forms later. Self-loathing, snobbish introspection, a tendency for sometimes evasive self-critique. This is not to say that any of these things are necessarily disingenuous, but that, at least sometimes, a certain level of arrogance can underline them. Here, it's rather obvious. Later, it becomes more challenging to detect, but detecting it is necessary to peel back one of the many layers of Sotos' writing. Take this passage. One short, fat, black cop patted me down in a holding area, after I'd been there for a couple hours and in full view of the other 20 or so prisoners, of course, and asked, "Any mo of those little boy pictures on ya? Have you got any mo of those little baby sex pictures in yo pockets?" Another stupid black pig wouldn't allow me within 10 feet of his desk. I had to shout the information he needed for his little form from the line of prisoners. Everyone else stepped to his desk. When I got there, he told me to move back, way back, and then announced to his partner, and everyone else, what I was there for. His partner, white, just shook his head. 2 Dago moron cops told the 2 black dicks flanking me as we walked to a courtroom to knock me down the stairs and get it over with. A fat-ass Mick pig banged on my cell at 4 o'clock in the morning to make sure I saw the newspaper with my photo in it. He said, "Everyone's really hot about having you here. How come everybody hates you so much?" They kept switching my cell. Every one of my cellmates was black. Not one gave a fuck. This would be bracing, and I guess in some way impressive, if not contradicted by the interview that opens Total Abuse. "And so they took you down to the station?" "Took me down to the station, interviewed me for a full day, put me in jail at night, so I missed night court even, and tried to keep me out of any situation where I could figure out what was going on. Just constantly switched my cell and really fucked with me a lot there. There's this process after you've been interviewed. It's sort of an old Starsky and Hutch thing. I did ask for a phone call. I did ask, what's going on? I haven't been charged with anything. I need to see a lawyer. And all this, and they said, oh, we just want to get some information now. This has nothing to do with that. Of course, they were going through my stuff at the time, trying to come up with charges. Even the next day, the next morning, when I was brought back before a judge, as soon as I went back to the holding cell, which was this huge cell where I was being threatened every second. What sort of threats? Well, just a bunch of fucking idiot blacks, basically, who had seen the news the night before. What was the substance of the threats? I was being spit on a lot, laughs, and there was actually one rather nice white supremacist who had, big surprise, got caught dealing speed, and he had his head bashed in, and he actually sort of watched over me. But I was acting like I was really fucked up on drugs, because it was just a really bad situation. The dissonance can be attributed to a few things. Time passing between the writing of Tool and the interview, the natural resentment for revealing one's own weakness, a desire to keep intact a certain tone, but I'm going to be less charitable. Sotos wanted to be a tough guy. Still wants to, really, in certain weird ways. How tough is defined might have changed over the years, but it's still the same impulse at its root. And beyond that, or as an expansion on it, a need for Sotos to define himself in a distinct way. As vulnerable and revealing as he can be as a writer, those qualities have always needed to struggle out from the membrane of his own impulses toward the character of Sotos himself. It's not an unusual impulse at all. Pretty universal for creative types in a way, especially those who have had to toil in obscurity for their whole careers, but it's one I feel the need to call out when I see it. Now, my coverage of this piece has been pretty narrowly focused on the stuff that I find most compelling, Sotos' interactions with the police officers. But there's a lot of other material here too, just not the kind that I find particularly unique or interesting. Much of the page space is dedicated to ruminations on true crime or child abuse, much in the vein of Pure, and while stronger and better written than most of the material in that zine, I don't find it especially compelling. In truth, it's always the mode of Sotos that I've found the least interesting, and much better and more dynamic versions of it emerge later in his career. A 9-year-old boy had been shackled to a large section of 2x4 specially fixed with a pair of handcuffs. In this helpless position, the boy's virgin young butthole was raped with a 17-inch hard rubber double-headed dildo. A thin glass rod was shoved up the hole of his dick. His mouth had been shut with black electrician's tape. After the torture and rape, the boy's genitals were severed from his body, in part by the killer's teeth. The boy was beaten and slashed and, finally, bled to death. I don't find it particularly compelling, but if that's what you're into, there's plenty of that here. It anticipates the dreamier, more free associative structure of later material, but it is, at the end of the day, early Sotos. From here out, we're going to tackle these pieces in what I feel are related pairs. One, because the rest of the material in Tool is largely simpler and more conventional stuff for Sotos in this era, and because I think the pairs are related to one another, thematically and through their sequencing in the book. They're also, barring the final pair, not the most interesting material available. Thematically, 2 and 3, along with another pair, 6 and 7, are largely retreads of the sort of material found on Pure, or more broadly, the sort of thing we typically associate with early Sotos. Sexual sadism, prostitutes, peep show booths in adult bookstores, abjection, degeneracy, filth, and so on. These two mentioned pairs seem to me to be filler material. It's of some inherent interest if you're here for Sotos, of course, but filler material nonetheless. I get the sense that this first pair might be the earliest material written for Tool, lacking much of the experimentation with structure and perspective that define the other work in the collection. That being said, they're here, so we'll discuss them. If there's a linking theme in 2 and 3, it's a relatively straightforward misogyny which would largely disappear in later work. Sotos is certainly not a great friend of women in later books, but rarely is his resentment of the female characters in his work so precisely rooted in their gender as it is in these two pieces. There's a lot of potential pairings of this interstitial material that could be plausibly arranged. I've settled on the ones I have here somewhat arbitrarily. But it seems to me that this particular contempt for women is a linking feature, as is the contempt for gay men in 6 and 7. Despite the vulgarity, misanthropy, and sadistic sexual obsessions of Sotos' work, misogyny itself is usually not a distinct driving force in his writing. For whatever failures Sotos might see in women as a group, they typically pale in comparison to the constant failures of human beings at large, the repetitious, banal kinds of self-deception that make them unable to fully experience existence. These pieces, though, feel more pointed. There's a special sort of resentment that existed then that seems to have eroded over time. 2 is pretty nondescript. A story about prostitution that predictably, and somewhat amusingly in its predictability, kicks off into an obsessive sort of fantasy of the hooker's eventual death by AIDS. It's a slight piece that doesn't really have a lot going for it beyond its sheer vitriol and descriptive energy. It's very much the kind of thing who people unfamiliar with Sotos would associate most closely with him. It also seems relatively clear that Sotos' initial impulse was the imagistic element, and that his attempts to draw out further meaning from it are a little forced. The greatest enthusiasm, we can see, is just in Sotos being Sotos at his most juvenile and resentful. To wit, her face is typical ghetto sludge, drunk, glassy eyes covered in yellow film, stupid hung mouth, ratty hair and wrinkles and blemishes, black shouldn't wear makeup, rouge or blush or whatever the fuck caked on, and mottled leather skin with deep pores and sores, greasy, so fucking old, moron, pathetic, dressed for sex, I think, Fuck only knows if she thinks she's sexy. Could be she's just advertising the act. Her availability. Couldn't be her looks, her attractiveness. Honestly, there is none. Lingerie, tight terry cloth skirt, and garish stained t-shirt. Tight over flaccid, unhealthy flesh hung loosely on sick bones and cheap muscles. The prose is pretty strong, for what it's worth. Energized, intense, vicious, and certainly in keeping with the house style. What doesn't work is a rather ham-fisted attempt to draw out a larger social conclusion, delivered rather inelegantly. All prostitutes are the same. A blowjob is a blowjob, and they're all a dime a dozen. A cheap kick, a quick fix of reality at a loser's expense. I know everything about her without having to hear her blather a single slurred syllable. They wear their failure like a full-body tattoo. They advertise it. And they're so wretched, so unimportant, so numb that it doesn't even matter if they know where they fit in. Not to them or me. They're all the same. Lips and tongue meat, thick and whore-painted, tits, used and worn, pulled to shreds by children and johns, gristled, hairy cunt like a fat old woman's mouth, pockholes deep and frequent, stretch marks, thick and long and thorny, black, contorted and bunched nipples, like a pig, like a dog, filthy and weak, like a cow waiting for the slaughter, like a downed goat too sick and destroyed to do anything but wait, alone, in pain, until someone finally pays some attention and disposes of the unsightly mess. None of this is bad, per se, but it seems a little contrived. At this point in Sotos' career, there's still a lingering issue of telling rather than showing. Given the ferocity of the descriptions in this piece, I feel like the more direct social commentary puts too fine a point on the material. To be fair, this is still very early work, and my relative boredom with this kind of thing is at least in part informed by his later work, which tackles these ideas in a subtler and more developed fashion. But I can't help but feel like the imagery does all the heavy lifting, and the reader should be trusted to draw out the intended conclusions from those alone. It may seem absurd, but I guess what I'm saying is that this particular piece about contempt for a streetwalker lacks the sophistication I'm looking for in such a thing. The primary point of interest here, though not really moving the needle very far in terms of quality, is the fixation on and description of AIDS death. It's really not much more than an elaboration on the contemptuous imagery previously described, but it does show Sotos trying to extract a more complex form of sadism in order to consciously elevate this above the material in pure. It can be pretty striking in the moment, even if it does lack real staying power, at least for me. I want to be there. I want to be there to see one black cunt whore finally die, in a bed from AIDS. I want to see the shit and piss stains on her paper gown, on her crumpled bed, on her scrawny legs and hands, and up and down her back and in her hair. I want to see the pus and tears and bile and vomit, the glazed eyes and limp mouth, the drool and spittle and cracked and creviced calloused skin, her pale and sweaty blackness. I want to see her scratch her cancer bumps and cankers. I want to watch her die. I want to see the scars from a year in bed. I want to see her shake and tremble and fall and bruise and bleed. She is nobody. I want to see her spirit giving up, having already been broken so long ago. She is meaningless. Dirt. No one comes for her. And the point is, before her coma, she wants someone to come. She thinks she needs someone to care. Care for her. Care about her. Anyway, it's like life. Nasty, brutish, short, and largely filler. 3 is a little more striking to me in its self-awareness, a very early echo of where Sotos' career would end up going, even soon after this very early material. In this piece, Sotos recounts a visit to a peep show booth, or perhaps a more generalized depiction of his experiences in these venues overall. The target of his ire, in this case, is the dancer, who he critiques in much the same manner as the prostitute in the previous piece, but with a little more nuance this time. Rather than merely targeting her appearance and social status, the emphasis here is more psychological, with Sotos ruminating on whether the girl behind the glass understands the inherent futility of her position. This theme, the inability of the underclass to transcend their stations, is one that Sotos will come to again and again over time, and with more nuance when he begins to realize that he's in much the same boat. For now, though, it's a pretty one-way relationship. What does she do when she fucks? Who would actually want to stick their dick in that thing? Would her father still want to? She fingers her asshole too much to be a dyke. Perhaps she's trying to form a friendship with the black janitor that mops up the cum around here. Does she think that maybe one day she'll look out and behind the glass will be Mr. Right with his balls and cock in his hand? Will he come, tuck in his wet cock, and take her away from all of this? Does she still believe in love, or just welfare? How does she feel when someone comes inside her cunt? Does she think of all the thousands of times she's seen cum drool out of men's cocks? This is near the end of the piece, after, as you would expect, plenty of rumination on the precise manner of her physical asymmetries, wretched childhood, overall stupidity, etc. I could read from some of those passages, but they're largely more of the same. If you've heard a handful of them, you've basically heard them all. I'm much more interested in what Sotos says about himself in this piece. Let me be clear, this is hardly a gotcha on my part. Plenty of people have advanced the idea that, shockingly, Sotos is perhaps no better than the people he criticizes. I firmly believe this is intended. But it's an undocumented feature early on which slowly gains prominence over time. And I think it's especially interesting in its embryonic form here, where Sotos' agonized self-awareness is a little less clear as to its deliberateness. In the near future of his bibliography, Sotos will begin to consider heavily the two-way street of these sorts of interactions, that as much as he might affect them, he is in turn affected by them. In 3, this idea is already present, but in a hesitant, deeply uncomfortable way, laced with a terse resentment that there could be any more depth to the relationship than buyer and seller. Take the first mention of such a thing, near the very beginning of the piece. My position, my station, is never in question, even though I've got my pants hanging open loosely around my hips, kept up by an odd, though not uncomfortable, spread leg posture, underwear bunched beneath my balls, cock in my hand. My lot in life, my reality can never be as low as that of the pig I'll watch dance behind the glass. Because I can leave. This is just a trip to the zoo. There's a lot of ways you could characterize this passage, but the word that immediately springs to my mind is defensive. An overwhelming defensiveness suffuses this piece, and it's very difficult to tell, for me at least, whether it's deliberate or not. Were this written in 2005, I'd say it was absolutely intentional. In the early 90s, I'm not so sure. Coming so early in the text, it's hard not to feel like this passage is a preemptive rebuttal to a perceived critique, but if so, it's not a very convincing one. I often say the following usually when one of my idiot fucking friends does something obviously stupid and is shocked by the results. You're never any better than the situation you're in. It's a tautology, sure, but those can be useful sometimes. It seems extremely obvious. Too obvious, even, that Sotos is certainly not better than the situation he's in. But that brings the question back around. Is this coming from a real place of defensiveness, or is this an especially early instance of the subtlety that makes his later work so fascinating to me? Take this passage a little bit later, where the emotional polarity is reversed from the previous reading. She wiggles and gyrates and bumps and grinds, but just barely. There's no excitement, no idea of freedom. Her moves are stock. Her demeanor is of boredom, disinterest, and nonchalance. I'm supposed to believe that this is just her job, that she's just pulling her shift. I should see that she feels pity for me, not contempt. I shouldn't see this as any big deal. It's not humiliating or desperate. I'm lonelier than she is, whorish. I'm an animal, and she provides a service. And if she seems jaded, it's just because she's seen all types of men, seen all types of cock, heard all the moaning and filthy suggestions, heard all the insults, seen all sorts of orgasms and kinks. But she's a chicken shit actress. Her dance is crude ostentation. It's contrivance and artifice, and it belies much more than just a job. This seemingly deliberate reversal of order suggests that Sotos, even at this early juncture, is more self-aware than he lets on. This push and pull between who the real loser is in the situation is something that adds a ton of color to a piece that is otherwise largely composed of the sort of angry, contemptuous ranting that much of Sotos' early work revolves around. I am, of course, cherry-picking the most interesting examples. Much of the material here is largely similar to what you'll find elsewhere. Just to prove that I'm not hiding anything fascinating from you, take this. Then he wants the whole package. Mom's out, or hopefully dead, or even better, drunk. He pulls the girl into bed, grabs her tits, pulls and grabs and licks and sucks her tiny titties, feels her ass, pokes at her tight asshole with his hairy finger. sticks his old tongue in her mouth and runs it around her throat. He climbs on top, jams his hard cock into her dry, tight cunt, pumps, comes, slurps, grabs, fingers, and does it all again and again. Not always enough time for the whole package. Teaches the little girl to suck him off, shows her how to use her tongue and where to stick it, shows her how he likes her to rub his balls when she gobbles on the end of his cock, how to suck on them balls, use her hand up and down and tight and lick the tip. Fucking slut, fucking whore, fucking cunt. Comes in her mouth every time. Again, nothing particularly surprising. I'll point out one last feature before moving on. The list-like collections of sentence fragments, an element that will be used throughout Sotos' career, either used to progress through an imagined narrative or explore a particular idea from different angles. This sort of lyricism would also be used to great effect in White House, though it's a bit of a chicken or egg situation as to what influenced what in this case. This device will be used regularly to punch home moments of particular aggression, often pivoting hard at the end of the list into a different subject entirely. While this technique appears a few times in Tool, it's most explicitly employed in 3. I'm not sure why exactly, but I consider this one in the upper echelon of the material in the book. I think it's that aforementioned give and take of the power dynamic which gives it a strange emotional intimacy largely absent from the rest of the work here. At first blush, it doesn't seem too different from the others, and it's not, at least in terms of general wavelength, but something about it has always stuck with me as being a cut above many of the other pieces. I don't know. I like the riff. There's no diplomatic way to say this. Pieces 6 and 7 feel largely like filler content to me. They are, perhaps more obviously than anything, Sotos working in a comfortable, established groove. I think that these two may have been the last things written for Tool, likely because Sotos liked the rhythm and symmetry of 8 pieces bookended on either side by more significant works. I rarely see these two talked about, probably because they're shockingly bland, which is a pretty rare criticism to level at Sotos. What's there to find? Nothing that you haven't seen in Pure, or, indeed, other parts of Tool. I think they're deeply unexceptional and not worth a ton of consideration, but for the sake of completeness, we'll take a look at them. 6 is especially nondescript, a rumination on Sotos' contempt for gay men through the prism of a casual sexual encounter with one, maybe an adult bookstore cruising session or something. He fixates on the self-deception and self-degradation of the acts involved, emphasizing especially how one can't separate one part of one's identity from another. That even if you're a family man who compartmentalizes his cruising experiences, these acts inherently reflect on your character. And, of course, being one of these characters doesn't make you special in any way. It's a bland charade that Sotos already has intimate familiarity with. Unfortunately, this acknowledgement of the banality of it all, especially at this point in the book, afflicts the reader as well. Every one of these tools thinks he's special. He's got a suburbanite wife and a couple of kids and plays sports with his buddies off from work, but Christ, I need a cock in my mouth, he figures. There's something extra to my existence. All sorts here. And all the same. The cocksuckers who invite you to their apartment, the gay ones, if you even just touch their cock, the perverts who are just lonely drivers and dwellers, and the husbands and old men who are just bleeding all over the fucking place, the dick lickers, the rimmers, ball tuggers and cock strokers, the ones who want it in their ass but don't make it too loud, the ones who wipe your cum on their cheeks and necks and then off with their shirt sleeves, the ones that give lousy, really lousy blowjobs, and the ones who want to suck your cock while it's soft, the same ones who have cummed in their palms before you even get hard. A big feature of the emotional wavelength of Sotos' work is desperation. It's a theme that we'll come back to over and over, but it's especially palpable in 6. What desperation means, exactly, will take different shapes. The most obvious and common one is male sexual desperation, but another typical feature is female desperation for a better life, or a child's desperation to avoid pain and fear. There's something enthralling to Sotos about desperation itself. maybe a sexual thrill, maybe just a fixation on its effect on the human animal itself, but it seems to me that the real focus of it is in how a person's self-understood identity is compromised in moments of intense desperation. The family man begging for dick at the adult bookstore, the woman participating in degrading sex work, the child insisting they'll do anything to avoid more pain, all of these instances of, understandable or not, personal compromise out of desperation. This will be explored more in the future. As interesting and deep a theme as this might be, it's not explored much beyond the surface level on 6. I get the sense that Sotos' intense anger and resentment in his early work was something of a stumbling block for him, so overwhelming it prevented him from cutting closer to the heart of his obsessions. Admittedly, this piece does feature some of the most extreme and sadistic content that we've seen out of Sotos so far. Even now, after having been exposed to this kind of thing numerous times, it's still a little shocking that a passage like the following was actually written out by a human being and sent to print. Cunt gets raped. Better be by her fucking dad for years and years, and better be brutal, with cameras and dildos and threats and kicks and slaps and razors. Cunt better cry for the rest of her life, 'cause she can't think of anything else. See that daddy dick in every Playgirl, underwear ad, and soap opera stud she ever flashes on. Cunt gets raped. Better fucking cut her hands off and beat her face to a bloody pulp. Leave her cunt split open asshole to navel. Make it so ugly she can't piss or shit or change her disgusting tampon with the lights on or her eyes open. Don't let her pass a mirror without falling to the floor in a sweaty, teary fit. Cunt gets raped. Better lock her in a basement somewhere and bleed the bitch. Make her eat your shit and drink your piss and suck your cock with a toothless mouth. Fuck her in the ass with your cock, fist, chair legs, lead pipes, and bricks. Slice her to pieces and bruise every inch of flesh and then piss and cum onto the open wounds. Certainly very extreme, but not very deep. It's the sort of bracing content that define pure and is elaborated on here, but it's not what I really care about most out of Sotos. It may be of more interest to you, though. Apart from this, the ruminations on gay promiscuity and the tea-room trade, as it were, would be expanded upon greatly in the future, starting most clearly with Index in just a few years, so I can't say that content is especially crucial either. Ultimately, a few points of interest, but filler nonetheless. 7, unfortunately, lacks even those minor points apart from preparing us for the real nadir of the book, Sotos fans already know. 7 is basically another riff on quality time, but with less murderous intent and without the benefit of that piece's position of immediate aggression at the front of the book. Or perhaps more accurately, it feels like a remix of the rest of the book. The first-person aggression of quality time, the ruminations on a prostitute's past in 2 and 3, the resentment toward male homosexuality in 6. It really has very little that is distinctly its own to offer. And naturally, given the pastiche-like nature of the piece, it seems remarkably unfocused, not merely in the manner of Sotos' standard dream logic, but like a bunch of notes cobbled together into a rough narrative. I don't like harping on the same point over and over, but filler is really the only way to describe it. Here's just one example of the unusually meaningless free association at work here. Come on, honey, let me know what you need. You liked it, didn't you? You liked it, right? I mean, I was good, right? Was it okay? Oh God, don't tell me. Am I a bad lover? What can I do? Wasn't I good? Didn't you get off? Huh? Didn't you get off, you fucking sleazebag cunt? Didn't we come? You fucking beast. You hairy dog. You pig. Have you ever seen faggots suck cock? You should. Maybe you'd learn something, you whore. Maybe you'd learn how to wrap that lipsticked whore's maw around a fucking man's cock the right way. Learn how to use your slimy tongue and garbage mouth like a real pig. Kiss the tip, make that noise, you know, all that porno shit. All that need shit. All that fucking corporal, loving, important shit. Let's share, sweetie. Most of the Sotos material that operates in this way generally has a narrative to follow, even if obfuscated by all the digressions and vulgarity, but this one simply doesn't. 7 does a little more than retread material already found previously in the book, but with no novel angle to approach it from. Even the intensity flags at this late juncture. It's extreme, and vulgar, and sadistic, and everything you would expect from Sotos, but it loses its bite through sheer similarity to everything that's come before. I think I'm gonna fuck you again before I let you shuffle off this great big playground. I think I'll wait another day or so. You looked pretty fucking scary the last time I took a long, close look. Your ribs and throat and legs especially. Far too thin. I love the way your skin is turning green from those bruises. You're quite a mess, you little fuck. I love how you stumble around, your clumsiness. I love the pain and hurt and terror in your youthful, wee, chubby face. I love the way my cock looked in your mouth and how it felt when I rubbed it and my balls all over your wet, red face. Oh, I like that a lot. And I like the way you bleed. I like the way you shit and piss and lose control. How you beg and plead and scream from your throat when you want your mommy and from deep down in your stomach when I hurt you. Maybe that's the point, the way the victim character in this one is variously a woman, a man, a child, that the incoherence of the identity in question is a further example of their dehumanization. But even if this is the case, it's not an effective piece. It's simply too diffuse and generalized to have a real impact, particularly coming from an author for whom specificity is a crucial tool. The lack of specificity here, the seemingly random jumble of imagery and commentary that lacks a particular narrative or theme, brings Seven dangerously close to being the sort of thing that Sotos detractors accuse him of being, a peddler of shock, empty of meaningful content or depth. If there's one important thing Seven does, it's this. It underlines that mere vulgarity and extremity has a half-life. It will soon become very necessary for Sotos to expand past these basic excesses in order to become an author of serious power. Fortunately, he does, but I can imagine a timeline where he doesn't, and instead spirals deeper and deeper into shock and aggression for their own sake. I imagine it would look very much like a career full of Seven. We've come to the last pair of works in Tool, and they're significant ones for a few reasons. One, they form the conclusions of sides A and B of the book, neatly dividing them into halves which complement and reflect one another. Two, they reimpose the concept of the Stabat Mater I referred to in Quality Time, centering once again around that concept in particular. And three, they very effectively represent Tool at its best and its worst. I can't think of any pairing that better encapsulates the embryonic brilliance of early Sotos equally alongside the juvenile frustration of it. To understand Tool at its highest and its lowest points, one needs only to read these two pieces. Additionally, they seem almost designed to explicate these two sides of Sotos in this era. Both are first person, both epistolary in their structure, both involve contact with the relative of a murder victim. They are inherently related works, but in terms of quality, they couldn't be further apart. 4 and 8 are, in a sense, the story of Tool itself. Here's the deal. Imagine me sitting backwards in a chair to rap with you kids. I haven't read all of Sotos' work. I've read more than most people, even many of those who would describe themselves as fans of his bibliography, but it's far from everything. I give this preface to say that even without having read everything, I feel very confident in saying that 4 is the single worst piece of writing Sotos has done, by a wide margin. It's this at the bottom, 20 or 30 blank slots, and then pure, and it goes up from there. It is an experiment that goes horribly awry. There is a reason why this particular structure has never been recreated, to my knowledge, in future work. It's because I imagine that even Sotos himself cringes involuntarily at 4. It's so laughable, contrived, and self-consciously posturing that it firmly establishes the low watermark in Sotos' career. If you can survive it, I assure you that things never get this bad again. But surviving it is difficult, and it would not surprise me if there were readers out there who encountered 4, rolled their eyes, and just never went back to the well. And everything wrong with it can be captured in 3 words. My dear woman. These are the 3 words that open the letter from a murderer to his victim's mother that comprises 4, likely based on Ian Brady's seemingly apocryphal letters sent to the mothers of his victims. 4 is presented as a victory lap, an opportunity for emotional sadism, and a harsh revelation as to her son's true character. Unlike the filler material in Tool, 4 doesn't suffer from a lack of focus. If anything, it suffers from too much focus, particularly too much focus on sucking really fucking badly. The ultimate crime here is one of tone, with Sotos adopting something that could be charitably described as somewhat vulgar Hannibal Lecter, and less charitably as "I'm da Joker, baby. My dear woman," and then. I hope you'll read all of this. To do that, I'm sure you'll have to fight an impulse to stop suddenly and tear it into tiny pieces. Either that, or you'll want to hand it directly to your prosecutor friend and spare yourself the bother of what you see as my perverted problems. But I'm hoping that you'll be able to draw on some of the enviable resilience you displayed at the trial and, with teeth and fists clenched tight, make it through to the end. I do understand how unpleasant holding a letter from me must be. I can appreciate that your thoughts throughout the length of this missive may center only on the state's failure to adequately silence me, but let me convince you of my worth for the length of this letter alone. Let me assure you, firstly, that contained herein is information you'll want to know in order to form a truly accurate portrait of your beloved son, and, secondly, that you can trust me to give you unflinchingly honest facts and opinions based on close and careful observation. You're certainly correct in questioning my motives for such a letter, and I won't attempt to lessen your possibly justified hatred and prejudice. But if I might be so bold, we find ourselves in a rather unique position. We share an extraordinarily intimate relationship with your son as loving catalyst and interface, and, whether you prefer to admit it or not, our relationship is, since the passing of your son, as close as either of us will ever be to him again. Every paragraph that follows is not in isolation as awful as this passage, but the reality is that short of the remaining material being the unexpurgated text of the brothers Karamazov, there is no fucking way that anything would survive that opening. You can actively hear the hiss of Clarice in the diction. It's literally difficult for me to read this stuff aloud and not lapse into a mocking supervillain monologue accent. Maybe I should just let it happen. What else is to be expected of me? I'm going to be extremely generous to Sotos in the future, although I think it will be largely justified, so for the sake of fairness, I think it's only appropriate to be suitably ungenerous here. The problem at the heart of 4 is an ideological, almost theological one. At this point in his career, Sotos still sees murderers as geniuses or artists rather than what they typically are. Total fucking retards with impulse control issues. He'll drift away from this conceit in the near future and confront it, albeit in a very strange and roundabout way in his middle career, but it's in full force here. In Pure, I talked about a certain kind of weird young man who gets fixated on the sorts of subjects that Sotos writes about, and to extend that metaphor, this perception of serial killers as apex predators is a pretty common feature of that type of guy. The smart ones who actually have some real creative impulse to them, end up growing out of this, and Sotos does as well. But he had the misfortune to document this juvenile phase through his written work. With that in mind, I can't fault him in particular for this dumb idea, but I can certainly roll my eyes at the products of it. While that impulse was annoying and Pure, it's doubly obnoxious here, when Sotos consciously attempts to embody this kind of fictional sadist, the deep misinterpretation of the serial killer's true nature becoming most obvious when he blends it with his own manner of thinking. Forgive me if I don't dismiss you as readily as you dismiss yourself, but I think your raw nerves and motherly mewling need some shaping. You need some motivational skills, some insight. A few less backpats, concerned hugs, and empty reassurances, and a few more details. All you have to do is look at the brutality of the act of the man. The fact is, he is a monster. Impressive, effective, I suppose, but you and I know, empty. Let's not let ourselves sink down to their level. Let's you and I disregard the convenience of histrionics and, instead, base our feelings, our honesty, on what we know between us. Which is to say that Danny was not a particularly bright boy. He wasn't especially pretty or endearing in even the most open or drunken circumstances. I know that your relationship with Danny wasn't all that close. The sheer frequency with which I saw him was enough to tell me that. But beyond that, I could see it every time I was with him. However, I would never question the strength of your influence and, of course, that very special elemental bond between a mother and son. The whole conceit of this piece is laughable. Ironically, Sotos might legitimately be channeling Ian Brady here, in that he is depicting himself as a sociopath who is sadistic and callous, but also deeply pretentious, narcissistic, and not one-tenth as smart as he imagines himself to be. The unfortunate thing is that this passage in particular does latch on to an idea that becomes very important in Sotos' career, and becomes central to some of his most powerful writing. The humanization of the victim, where said humanization necessitates a warts-and-all understanding of the person they were, not the saintly vision they become only after death. This idea is not only a conceptual anchor for Sotos, but a crucial part of unpacking the greater ideology behind his work, which will only really start bearing fruit many books down the line. The misfortune comes from its genesis emerging here, in such a deeply dumb place, which can easily undercut its more thoughtful and meaningful versions down the road. The landing, unsurprisingly, is not stuck. 4 ends with the following. Additionally, I'd like to hear more about yourself. Maybe how I've made you feel in light of all the press and pure attention you've received. Nothing wrong with a little limelight, and I certainly don't mean to suggest that you're an empty, worthless media hog. In fact, I think the photo of you shrieking and crying at the courthouse when the caption below read, "Danny's mother declined comment," was especially tactful. You did look old in that shot. That was probably enough of a comment. But I'm talking more specifically about how I've given your rather special mothering technique that rare stamp of legitimacy. You'll no longer be a piece of trailer camp white trash with a faggot junkie whore for a son. You're forever now a poor, blameless mother who has suffered unspeakable injustices, inconceivable tragedies, gross disadvantages. Violence is quite a purge, my dear woman, and when I think of the gleaming coincidences we share, it's mildly disturbing to me that we're not much closer. I'm sure you'll agree. Hope to hear from you soon. Yes, violence is quite a purge indeed. Perhaps we're not so different, you and I. A sign of things to come, will this mother discover a darker side of herself in a future installment? God, I fucking hope not. For all our sakes, let's move on. 8, the concluding piece, is equally experimental but much more effective, and stands out as one of the strongest in the collection and a surprisingly powerful note to end on. Its power, strikingly and rather tellingly when placed in relation to the rest of Tool, is located precisely in doing what the other pieces staunchly refuse to do, reducing the volume. 8 is, like 4, another letter to the mother of a murdered child, but in this case, one coming from a place of sympathy, respect, and admiration, and maybe too much of all those things. The ugliness and perversity of 8 is far subtler than anywhere else in the book, and it cuts more deeply as a result. I think this is deliberate. After 7 individual works of often effective but also equally numbing brutality and vulgarity, this sudden swerve hits the reader in an undefended part of the psyche. There might be an argument to make that the entirety of Tool is a preparation for this piece in particular. I don't think it is, but I think that's a fair critical assessment one could make. Speaking on critical assessments, I've got my own kind of weird one. I'm not the kind of guy who's really into fixating on subtext, alternate readings, and theory crafting, all that lit nerd shit, but something about 8 has always stuck with me. The anonymous writer of 8's letter is so freakishly intrusive and probing, so grotesquely empathetic to Mrs. Anderson's plight, that it rings to me as almost entirely insincere. Rather than taking it at face value, what if we were to imagine that this is actually a letter written by the child killer himself? That he's interested in probing the already wounded underbelly of his victim's grieving mother? It would make sense for the sheer audacity of the text. I'm not going to advance it as a theory, as though I've unlocked some heady secret, but it is the way I like to read the text, and I think it works just as well as a more straightforward reading. From near the opening of 8. I'm hoping, Mrs. Anderson, that you'll allow me the small amount of time it will take to read this letter and afford me the chance to share some of my personal thoughts and feelings. I think I can help. It's been some time now since your daughter was stolen from you, and I'm sure the pain is no less now than it was on the very first day you found out. I can only guess at how painful it must be for you to have to relive the incidents and memories, although I know your confusion and distress will never abate. Life can be so unfair. Life can be so cruel. I wonder why we ever expect it to be honorable and kind. I understand from some of the many interviews I've read with you and your husband that you've found solace through God. I understand that the priest at St. John the Baptist Church has become very close and important to you these past months. It was the priest who told you that little Lisa's body had been found, wasn't it? And I was glad to see that you gave your press conferences at the church as well as Lisa's school, two institutions that represent the venerable sanctity of family life and honest morality. It's hard to perceive the needling in a passage like this one as anything other than deliberate. Regardless of whether my reading of the text in this manner was intended or not, the point Sotos is making is rather clear, that even within the good faith efforts to examine this sort of event, pornography is found, with the money shot in this case being located in the eroticized and collectivized mourning over the crime. Sotos often makes it clear that his intent is not to point out the hypocrisy of the news media, though I would argue that he frequently does, whether he deliberately wants to make a point of that or not. It's clear in this piece, though, that the target is quite specifically not the media apparatus covering the material, but the parasocial relationship that viewers can develop with victims through the publicity of the coverage. The public quality, I believe, is a crucial one. Remember that Sotos largely does not have access to material that is not available to the public. His work on Buyer's Market, for example, is expressly made up of publicly available material. Through this, we can see that the media apparatus is merely the vector through which the pornography is distributed, not really the manufacturer of the content itself. Furthermore, a great deal of emphasis is placed on the complicity of everyone involved in these bizarre, almost theatrical displays of grief and mourning. By allowing these moments of emotion to occur in the public square, so to speak, they are distributed to an audience who, by virtue of that publicity, takes those emotions on as their own through empathy, be that appropriate or not. And in the case of 8, a point is made to display just how extremely inappropriate it can be. I remember your pleas to the abductor the first day and next. I want him to know that he and anyone who knows about this must come forward. Bring her home. We need all the help we can get. I can't think of her out there in the fields. I can't think of anything. I am praying and hoping, praying so very hard. I just wonder if she's cold, if she's hungry. Please, just please, let her go. I was very touched by your sad desperation, your powerlessness and vulnerability. I remember seeing your young and puffy face on TV. You were chewing your lower lip and staring down at the ground. You broke into tears at the end. I just wish he'd let her go. I don't know how someone could do this. She was just out for a bike ride like any other day. I just don't see how it could happen. Still, I think your most dramatic moment was on TV when you kissed a small, pocket-sized photo of your little dear, your one and only 7-year-old baby, and tried to fight back the tears and stuttered your own personal message to Lisa through the cameraman's lens. I love you very much and I want you to come home. Happy birthday, my little girl. There's no way to be honest on camera. There's always an aspect of performance. A particle changes its behavior when observed. The best you can hope for is the pornographic representation of yourself that an audience can project its fears, fantasies, and aspirations onto. Any emotion portrayed will be tortured far beyond its limit through the machinery of the observer's own mind. You can try to be authentic, you can tell your life story, disgorge all your secrets, even show off your dead kid, but it'll still turn into whatever the person on the other side of the screen wants it to be. But we're still compelled to do it. Endless self-expression, attempts to communicate some kind of inner state, expressed in a form so pure it resists all efforts to be mutated. And the worst part is that sometimes it's not even a camera you're speaking into. Sometimes it's just another person's face. This man, this total stranger, has proven himself capable of a crime that created such an immense cavity in your soul that, perhaps, the only way to plug it up will be by becoming the person you never thought you could let yourself become. You almost have to allow yourself the chance to be consumed by hatred and blinded by confusion over injustice and human cruelty, so that everything else that was previously important to you, empathy, sympathy, gentleness, care, and concern, doesn't kill you by their weight and unmanageability. Those things you thought were real before are now too cumbersome and ungainly. Those feelings have to be changed. The lines in your face, the stretch marks on your belly, and the gray in your hair all must attest to something new, something unplanned and unprepared for, something that reflects how life truly is, something that blots out all the tenderness and care and fantastic daydreams and naive misconceptions about love and equality, something true and real.
I wonder what it would be like. There's a car coming that way now. I wonder what it would be like if I just jumped in front of it. If I just jumped in front of it, threw my head under the wheel, and just completely cut off my connection to this world. I don't know. It's all fantasy. I wouldn't do it, but I like to indulge in it. There's a very famous cruising spot right there for all the faggots. There, and over there down in the middle of the field, there's like some hidden steps where guys go in there and suck and fuck each other off. I've always wanted to do it. I'm too scared. I don't know of what. I think it's a connection with the other one. It's frightening to imagine that there could be someone else out there that wants you, but not for any emotional need, just purely physical one. And someone that hates their own body, like myself, can possibly see what's worthy about it. So it feels really frightening. There's the cruising spot, right on there, near those steps, right outside of the road. Sotos is someone that really made me want to go cruise, especially because of how degrading and violent and aggressive it all sounds written by him.